Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining Anthony and I on a Wednesday morning that will hopefully get warmer as the morning wears on. You're here for a 90-minute webinar on scenario planning, and many of you have already attended either the in-person or the virtual training that we did for HJRA. So some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today may be familiar to you because of your participation in the class, but if not, that's okay too. We're going to introduce, helpful frameworks and tools to help you navigate some of the uncertainty in the operating environment right now. But before we get started, we want to introduce ourselves for people who haven't gone through the class already. My name is Deborah Steinkoff. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been a nonprofit professional for 35 years. And about 20 of those years, I've been in executive leadership roles, either executive director, deputy director, and I've also done a number of interim executive director gigs. In my consulting world, I am a grant strategist and an executive coach, and I also help organizations do strategic planning. And in 2022, I started the Nonprofit Financial Leadership Academy with my friend and colleague Anthony here because we wanted to build financial literacy amongst nonprofit leaders. So glad to be here with all of you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Petchel. I'm he, him pronouns. I'm your other trainer this morning. The lens that I'm bringing to this, I spent the first 15 plus years of my career, I call it my accidental career in finance and banking, before I pivoted to the nonprofit space where I for a little over a decade, led fundraising and communications teams for organizations, mid and size organizations. I worked in the affordable housing and human services space. And then for the last 4 years, I've been full-time strategic planning consultant, and I do a lot of executive recruiting for organizations as well. And I'm zooming in from just south of Oregon City today.
Before we get started, we want to let everyone know that the information we're presenting here is for educational purposes only. It's not intended to serve as legal, accounting, or tax advice for your specific organization. So what we're going to cover in our 90 minutes together today, we're going to start off with sort of why we actually do scenario planning, why it's important, how it's a valuable tool for our organizations. We're going to walk through the process to create a scenario plan, and then we're going to talk specifically about financial planning and scenario budgets. And then we're going to walk you through a scenario planning tool. It's a guide that we created, which I sent out via email at the end of day yesterday. So you may have not seen that in your inbox already, but it's a guide that Anthony and I developed. And then there is an Excel workbook that sort of is an accompaniment to the guide that gives you some sort of sample things that we'll be talking about today, like the budget scenarios. So let's get started. So what is scenario planning? It's kind of a buzz term. Maybe we've done some of this in our role as organizational leaders. Maybe for some of us, scenario planning is sort of new, but it's essentially a process for identifying uncertainties in the operating environment and then developing different scenarios in response to those uncertainties, and then based on those scenarios, creating some actionable plans. It can help, scenario planning can help with both challenges and opportunities in the operating environment. I think we're all sort of experiencing a lot of challenges right now, but there are times when we're also needing to do scenario planning in response to some opportunities. So scenario planning helps to create multiple responses to different scenarios. And most scenario plans start off with sort of the best case scenario, which is, there are minimal risks to the organization. You're either planning to grow programs and services, or maybe the best case scenario is that you're able to maintain current programs, services, and operations. And then there's often sort of a moderate risk scenario, which may be a reflection of some moderate funding decreases in one or more funding streams, where you will have to make some decisions about mitigating that. And then there's usually a significant risk scenario where there is significant reduction in one or more of your funding streams, and it may result in some reductions in staff, some program reductions, maybe even eliminating some programs. And then there's the worst case scenario, which is your mission is at risk. There are significant reductions in multiple funding streams. You're no longer able to sustain the work, and you're having to make some decisions about whether or not you need to sunset, whether or not you need to merge with another organization, that kind of thing. So our scenario planning guide sort of covers those sort of four different scenarios: best case scenario, moderate risk scenario, significant risk scenario, and then the worst case scenario. And then these scenarios function as a roadmap for your organization as you navigate the uncertainties in the operating environment. So there are a lot of benefits to scenario planning. It takes time, it takes resources. We're all pretty stretched, but it is a great planning tool. It's a strategy for building organizational sustainability and resilience. It's a strategy for being adaptive. For those of you who went through either the virtual or in-person classes Anthony and I have been doing for HGRA, we talk a lot about the core capacities needed for organizational effectiveness. And one of those capacities is adaptive capacity, right? The ability to sort of keep an eye on what's going on in the operating environment and then adapt to it. Well, scenario planning is a great adaptive strategy. It offers you a framework for identifying and responding to threats and opportunities. It helps you think through responses to those different threats when you're not in the midst of managing a crisis. Once you're in crisis, it's really hard to sort of pull back, take a higher level view, and do sort of scenario planning. Scenario planning also helps you pivot more quickly since you've thought through in advance different responses to different uncertainties. And then lastly, it helps you stay aligned with your strategic priorities. If you've done scenario planning, it's mission focused, it's centering your strategic priorities to maintain your mission. Again, if you're not responding in the midst of crisis, you're just going to be more strategic.
So as a financial leaders, it's important for us to kind of, from a professional development perspective, invest in our own learning around the process of scenario planning. So just like if you were to take a CPR class and you practice, on one of those like CPR dummies and you kind of learn how to do it, that in a moment where you're not in crisis. So that way, when the crisis does happen, you've already have all of that experience. You have that kind of muscle memory that can kind of kick in. And so scenario planning is the same thing. We want to do the planning process. We want to think through all of these different what if scenarios and create plans that we can then implement when we're not in crisis. Because when we're in crisis, we're not thinking clearly. So we want to make sure we've done all of the clear thinking beforehand. And so scenario planning has 4 steps to that process, which we're going to walk through today. The first step is you need to identify, well, what are those uncertainties that we're going to be planning for? So we need to think through and pick here's a what if scenario situation that we need to have a plan for. Once you've identified that, then you need to identify and essentially create that scenario. And there are 4 key elements that define what a scenario is, which we'll walk through. Once you have those scenarios defined, you then come up with, well, what are our potential action plans? Now, these action plans aren't set in stone, but they're designed to give you a framework. So if that scenario does come to fruition, we already have a plan outlined for what we're going to do. And sometimes those scenarios need to have multiple different plans depending on exactly how that scenario kind of unfolds. Once you have those action plans identified and written down, you then want to practice them. you're going to need to revise and update them as you get new information and the world continues to change because you want to be able to be adaptive. Okay, this scenario plans are not designed just to sit on the shelf in a binder and just pull if there's only an emergency. We have to constantly be updating them and continuing to practice that scenario planning process as a leader. So Deborah's going to walk us through the first step of identifying those uncertainties.
So, as organizational leaders, the first thing we need to ask ourselves when engaging in scenario planning is what's happening in the operating environment that could potentially impact my organization, that maybe already is impacting my organization. And right now, I think most of us can say a lot. There's a lot going on in the operating environment that is impacting and can potentially have deeper impacts to my organization. So there are a lot of uncertainties to plan for. Certainly changes in current and potential funding streams flowing into our organizations. New money may mean we can scale up our programs, whereas a loss of money may mean we need to scale down. And that's happening for a lot of organizations right now who saw some reductions in their burn contracts. There are changes to our expenses as a result of macroeconomic forces like inflation that we need to plan for, and there's still a lot of economic uncertainty that we need to plan for. And that economic uncertainty isn't just about inflation and impacts on our expenses. There's also a lot of economic uncertainty about the availability of government funding. And a lot of economic uncertainty also impacts individual giving, the motivation and capacity of our individual donors. Policy changes also impact the availability of government funding at all levels. And even though we're seeing most of the funding cuts on the federal level impacting organizations that are directly funded by federal agencies, the reality is that's going to trickle down to the availability of fund on the state and local level because state and local governments rely on federal funding for the programs and services that they fund. Other things to plan for, workforce challenges, for example, in a tight labor market, it may be challenging to fill certain positions, and that has a ripple effect in terms of reimbursements from contracts. If we are committed to hiring people with lived experiences, that means we're often hiring people sort of at the beginning of their professional journeys. And so we have to offer opportunities to train up entry level folks. So that's something that we need to plan for. And then succession planning is also critical, especially for nonprofit sustainability. Unplanned executive transitions can be very destabilizing for an organization. So succession planning is sort of helpful. So that doesn't happen to your organization. It can be very painful. And then we need to plan for changes in community needs. We need to, as social service providers especially, we need to continue to be responsive to community needs, which can change over time or can change during times of crisis. Thinking back to the height of the pandemic and what some of the community needs were around just basic needs and stable housing. And then lastly, we need to plan for competitive funding, especially in the current operating environment. Foundation funding in particular has become increasingly competitive, and a lot of organizations are turning to foundation funding to help sort of fill the gap in losses in government funding, which is going to make foundation grants even more competitive. And then we just need to be adaptive and be able to plan for the things that we don't yet know. And there are things coming down the pike given the current operating environment. So lots of things to think about in terms of what we need to plan for.
Deborah, I was going to add one thing on that. Sometimes you might need a plan for both the positive and the negatives happening at once. Just thinking about funding, where you might have one funding source be reduced at the same time new funding sources are coming online. And so sometimes those happen, the good and the bad happen at the same time. And a lot of times we don't think about that. So it's something that just to keep in top of mind right now with all the changes.
Which can be really challenging when you're seeing loss of funding in one area and you're having to make decisions about program and staff reductions while maybe scaling up a new initiative because a new funding source became available. Real quick, let's just put this in the chat because we think it's really helpful to share some of the challenges that we're all facing. Just put in the chat some key challenges affecting your organizations right now. Maybe they're related to funding, maybe they're related to workforce challenges and trying to hire vacant positions. Maybe they're related to trying to meet overwhelming need for your services. What are some of the external challenges affecting your organizations? Funding, turnover, staff retention, having to do budget revisions multiple times as part of the contracting process for burn funding,
Yeah.
lower grant funding, especially for operating support. We hear you, Laura or Heather. Yeah. Staff reductions, changes in service areas, changes in membership in the local burns, overwhelming demand for services. I think especially for folks providing the services that all of you provide when there's uncertainty out there in the economy and people are feeling more stressed, there's going to be more demands for the types of services that you provide. Lots of coverage. I'm assuming you're talking about the Oregon Health Plan and Medicaid coverage, Shanti. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Lots of challenges, lots of things for organizational leaders to have to think about in the current environment. And hopefully if you take some time to do some scenario planning, you can get out in front of some of these challenges. New processes for getting the money. So true. I felt like with this last round of Measure 110 money, the rules were changing as we were going, for sure. So, thanks for sharing. Those were all very helpful and interesting, and a lot of them are shared challenges across organizations. Now we want you to just take a minute or two to write down on a piece of paper, in a Word doc, 3 challenges in the operating environment that you think your organization should scenario plan for. We'll take a couple minutes to do that, just so you can refer back to that when you start looking at the scenario planning guide.
When I do this, I like to have them on a sticky note. I'd put it on my computer, just kind of keep it top of mind, but also it kind of, when you visualize it that often, it helps you to kind of become less afraid of those scenarios because you're seeing them and thinking about them more frequently. So sometimes it's good to have that process of writing it down, start to kind of give names to things. Okay. So once we have identified those potential uncertainties that we know, okay, there's a potential uncertainty that we need to plan for, now we need to create the scenario around that plan. And there's 4 kind of key elements to what you need to think about when it comes to creating a scenario. And the purpose of these 4 elements is to really give you focus, okay? And one of the challenging things when we're faced with these moments of uncertainty is there's so much unknown. There's so much choice. There's so many different things that we can do. And when you think about your scenario in terms of these four elements, it really helps us to bring focus on where are we having, where is this potential uncertainty going to have the most impact on our organization, and how can we then mitigate and affect that scenario. So you need to think about your organization, and this means as a financial leader, you really, and whoever is creating these scenarios, really needs to holistically understand your organization, how the work gets done, your business model, how funds flow through your organization, how you fund the work, where you're operating really efficiently and where you're not within the organization. So this is kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have to really know and internalize our organization. We then need to look at, for that potential uncertainty, what are all those potential external factors that are going to impact our organization? And not all of those external factors around that uncertainty are going to have a direct impact on our organization. So this part of this exercise is in identifying where is that overlap between those external factors and our organization. So that way we can kind of push aside the things that we don't need to worry about. Again, this is all about getting focused. We also need to think about, for those external factors, what type of change is this factor going to have? And there's both good and bad changes. But whether it be a positive change or a negative change, change is still change, and change is hard, and change takes us to adapting even within good change. So we have to think about what type of change is this factor going to have. And then lastly, we need to think through, what is the time frame for this scenario to potentially take place? Is it immediate, like this is happening tomorrow, or is this like, oh, this is a 5 to 10 year long period? Okay, this is the challenge that we have in scenario planning, is sometimes when things are too far away, like we tend not to give it the same amount of mental weight. And this is really important that we define the time frame, and that way we're also still making sure that we're doing the scenario plan appropriately. So the first one is knowing your organization. And this is a really key part of being a leader in an organization, is that holistic understanding of how our organization kind of works. And for the scenario planning purpose, we need to think through, what part of our organization are we going to focus this scenario on, okay? And what level is this going to be impacting our organization, this uncertainty that we're planning for? And so, this could be where it's impacting the entirety of the organization. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it might just be impacting a very specific department, or a very specific population, of clients that you're serving. So as you're thinking about that uncertainty, you want to identify where in our organization is this uncertainty going to have an impact. And so we can then focus on that. And again, this is about getting focused, so that way we aren't getting overwhelmed with too much to think about and too much choice. So, we'll take, say funding, for example. How is that going to impact, what part of our organization is it going to impact? Is it going to impact our employees? And a lot of times that will, because, that funding is directly tied to paying for people to do the work. It might impact the number of clients that we're serving, and we might have to think about different delivery mechanisms, or maybe reducing services. It might impact our ability to work with partners, okay? And so thinking about those different pieces. So once you've identified your uncertainty, you want to then identify where in our organization is this uncertainty going to impact. So that way we can identify, where we need to create that scenario. Next, we need to think through, what are all those external factors? And sometimes those external factors might be internal factors, but typically they're going to be things happening outside of the organization that are going to impact your organization. But you need to think through, what are those external factors? And those external factors are things that we're going to be planning for, that one, are out of your control, okay? Because if it's in your control, it's not, we don't need a scenario plan, we need a plan. And so things that are out of your control, like policy changes, at the federal or state level. And then those external factors also have to have an impact on your organization. Now, there are going to be a lot of external factors that are out of our control that aren't going to impact our organization. And this last part is really important, because right now and this is done on purpose by the current administration, we are being bombarded by so many potential impacts. I mean, you just read the news, and it's just like, it's designed to overwhelm. And so part of this process is putting on those blinders. If you've ever seen an old like horse and buggy where they have the blinders on the horse, it's the way the horse is always focused on where they're supposed to be going because there's all these other distractions that we need to kind of pull away. So for those external factors, we want to put those blinders on and we want to focus on what of these external factors is going to have an impact on our organization. And so some examples right now we're dealing a lot with is just politics and changes in policy. Okay, but not all of those changes are going to impact our organization or what we're scenario planning for. And so identify and write down the things that are and are not going to impact our organization. There's a lot of external factors around the economy. And again, thinking through for this scenario that we're building, what are some of those things that we need to kind of think about that are going to have an impact on our organization? Changes of funding, is a big one. Changes of technology. AI seems to be on everyone's mind right now. That may or may not be impacting this scenario for your organization. So if it's not, then we can kind of put that aside so we don't need to think about that for this scenario. Okay. So it's really important that we both think about those things that are out of our control and are going to have an impact. And sometimes those could be internal kind of things that might be out of your control, but ideally, these are always going to be things outside the organization that are impacting internally. If you identify going through this process something that is internal, you typically are going to have more control over that. And so that way you want to then move from scenario planning to actually planning and say, let's address this first, okay? Next, we have the change. And this is one where we have to really think through, okay, here's the part of our organization that we're planning for. Here's the external factor. What type of change is that factor going to have? And not all changes are negative, okay? And so we need to think through, what do we need to plan for? Is this going to have a flat impact on our organization as far as like there's really not going to be a lot of change? Is it going to create growth? Is it going to create rapid growth? And we saw this a lot when during the pandemic or during initial kind of pushing out of say new program dollars, where all of a sudden your budget doubles or triples or quadruples. That's rapid growth. I mean, that's a lot of change that you have to adapt for. Okay, so what happens when you have this rapid growth scenario? That might be the type of change. Sometimes it might be transformational, where we actually have to completely transform our organization to show up and think differently. This happened to a lot of groups during the pandemic, where all of a sudden they had the change was we have to completely rethink how we do our work because the world has changed. That's transformational. So that, and that could be good and bad, so it's not always negative. We also have to think through, like, is this change going to have a decline on our organization? Is it going to negatively impact our organization? But this might be a decline in funding. This might be a decline in the number of people we can serve. And as you kind of go down that, it might be actually we're crashing. Like it's the whole program is getting cut. I mean, that's a crash. And then another change, which is the hardest one out of all of these, is just chaos. And that's a lot of what we're feeling right now, where it just doesn't, we just don't know what the change is. We know there's change happening, but there's so many different things. It's growth, it's decline. And so one of the key things to do in this part of the exercise is really try to narrow down the scenario as much as possible. How do we get from the chaos? Let's pick one section of that chaos and really dive into, is this a declining change? Is this a growth change? What is that change? Because if you feel like it's just chaos right now, you're looking at too many things at once. And so part of this exercise in identifying the changes for this scenario, let's try to get down into the weeds a little bit and figure out what specifically within that external factor, what change are we going to create a scenario around. So once you've identified the type of change that's going to happen, then you need to think through the timeline. And this is one where you want to make sure that as you're going through the scenario planning process, you want to start first a lot of times with the things that could potentially happen sooner rather than later. It doesn't mean that we ignore the things that are longer timeline, but we also have to do some prioritization. So when you think through that change, you think through those factors and what part of your organization is going to impact. Is this something that's happening right now in real time? Okay. Is this something that could potentially happen over the next couple of months or over the next coming fiscal year? So depending on the time frame for the change, one is going to prioritize of all your different scenarios, where do we need to focus first? But also, the sooner something is going to potentially happen, the more information that we have, the farther out in time that a change is going to occur, the more guesses we have to make. So if it's something that's going to happen in 5 to 10 years, say a succession plan, you're planning for leadership transition over the next 5 to 10 years, there's a lot that we don't know that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. But if it's something that's going to happen in the next 5 days, it's going to be a lot more accurate. It's like the weather forecast. Like, it's going to be pretty accurate for the next day or two. But as you get out to past day 10 or, a month out, you're really just making some really big guesses. But there are going to be times where you just don't know what the timeline is. Okay. And that is, I feel like, what's happening a lot right now, where we don't know what the timeline is. A funding cut could come tomorrow. It could come 2 years from now. And so when you don't know that time frame, a lot of times what's best to is just assume that it's going to be in the near term and approach it as if this is something that's going to happen in within the next month or two. Okay. Because at least that way you have an immediate plan if something is going to happen, and you can always adjust that and adapt it as you go. So those 4 areas then essentially create your scenario, and different scenarios are going to have different levels of risk. Okay, and as Deborah was talking about earlier, that risk might be there is some risk. There's changes. There's always risk to our organization, but we're mostly going to be able to maintain our current operations. We're just going to have to make some adjustments to all the way to worst case scenario where the core of our mission is at risk. So as you create this scenario, just kind of create these levels of and identify, okay, what level of risk is this? Because the level of risk is then going to determine what type of action plans and what type of decisions are we going to have to make. Okay, essentially, the higher the level of risk, the more significant the decisions you're going to have to make. And the more significant the decisions you're going to have to make, the more you're going to want to practice making those decisions. Okay, if you're having to think about, we have to cut an entire program, and that means we're laying off 20 people, that's a really hard, crappy decision that you're going to have to make. Okay, it's going to take, as a leader, it's going to take more time and practice to really think through, how do we do that right if we're faced with that situation. Okay. And so once you've identified those scenarios, you've identified the level of risk, this then essentially gives you a guide for what type of action plans are we going to need to put in place. Okay, are we talking about minor tweaks, or are we talking about major significant changes? Okay. So where do you start in action planning? We have our potential scenario. Now we need to come up with, what are our potential action plans to mitigate that scenario, or what do we do in that what if situation? So where do we start? So first thing you need to do is identify what are the threats that you are essentially creating this plan around. And threats can be, the 3 big ones to think about is, how is this going to impact people? Okay, both the people in your organization, your staff, your volunteers, the people that you serve, your funders, your donors, volunteers, community members. So think through, what are the threats to people? What are the funding impacts? So how is this scenario going to impact our ability to fund the work? And then you also have to think about the public relations, the communication piece, the outside perception of this scenario. Okay. So once you identify kind of those potential kind of threats, where is this? How is this going to impact? It's going to impact our people. It's going to impact our funding and be able to do the work. It's going to have maybe a positive or a negative impact on our PR. Once you do that, you then want to then think through, okay, well, how would we mitigate that situation? Okay, so if we have a potential funding cut that's going to impact our ability to maintain staffing levels, which is then going to impact our ability to deliver services, what do we need to do to mitigate that situation? So what are the infrastructure needs that we need to have in place to um, deliver, maybe continue delivering services, but in a different way? What are the short-term sustainability measures that we need to have in place to keep operations going while we're implementing our scenario plan? And so this is where we're going to talk about having cash reserves, having different levers we can pull to impact our funding. We also need to think about like what are those long-term financial plans. So in the short term, we're going to have things that will help us keep afloat while we're implementing a scenario. But what happens if this scenario drags out for 3 months, 6 months, a couple of years? This is what happened during the pandemic, where a lot of us, when we first went into lockdown, we thought, oh, that we're going to be in lockdown for a week or two. Well, that didn't happen. So what happens when a week or two then becomes several months or a year or two? Okay, so we also need to think through that long-term planning, and ultimately we need to think through what are we going to change as far as how we deliver our programs. And that is the hardest mitigation thing that we have to think about, because it starts to get to how do we change how we deliver upon our mission. Okay. So when you're doing this and you've identified those threats and start thinking through the mitigations, the key is to focus on what are our core mission activities. You can go to the next slide, Deborah. These are the must-haves in our organization. Okay, and every organization has must-haves. These are our core programs. This is our core infrastructure for the organization, how we're set up and structured. This is our core fundraising activities, how we fund the work. This is compliance related, especially with all of your organizations with having highly restricted funds. You have a lot of compliance that you have to adhere to. So what are identifying what are those core things, like at the core we have to do these things, or else we don't exist as an organization. And then we have a nice to have pile, and every organization has the nice to have things. Okay, and so sometimes we need to think through. And Deborah's going to walk us through a process for how to identify those programs that that we do, but might actually not be as high as an impact on our mission as we think. And so going through and evaluating those programs. So we want to focus on our really high impact core mission activities. We might have programs that are nice to do, but they come at a high cost. That high cost might be a dollar cost. That high cost might be a time cost. So we want to think through those things, and those might be something that we need to think about cutting. We might have some fringe benefits, some nice things that we do when we have sufficient funding and we're trying to maintain work-life balance and sustainability. But sometimes, like at the core, sometimes we need to cut through some of those. This is thinking through like how do we maintain the cake but maybe get rid of some of the sprinkles. The sprinkles make it fun. It makes it in the long term sustainable for all of our employees. We still need sprinkles on our cake. But in times of crisis, sometimes we have to really think through what are the core parts of that cake, okay, and find that balance.
I just want to add too that a lot of organizations often look to non-core program activities to cut first. And for instance, fundraising, staffing, or maybe you use a fractional or contract model for some of your fund development activities. It's a temptation to eliminate those positions and contracts before eliminating program positions. And it's really important to keep in mind that those fundraising responsibilities will then fall on somebody else who may or may not have the skills and expertise to execute your annual fund development plan really, really well. So there's a ripple effect in eliminating fundraising positions first in order to be able to maintain program positions, because it's ultimately going to impact, the money that you're able to bring, especially if one of your strategic priorities is to diversify your funding and maybe bring in more funding from individual donors or foundation grants to make up for the loss in government funds. If you eliminate salaried and contract positions to bring those monies in, then you're going to be probably having to make deeper programmatic cuts down the road. All of this is really hard stuff. I just, I want to acknowledge that the most challenging things we have to do as organizational leaders are having to make decisions about program and people, especially during lean times and times when our funding is threatened. So we don't take any of this lightly. We know as we're introducing these frameworks and these tools that we are talking about people ultimately, right? The people who do the work and the people who benefit from the work. And these are really, really hard choices you have to make, but we still need to make them as organizational leaders, even though it's the hardest thing we have to do. And we need frameworks and tools to guide those decisions. So this next tool is called the Matrix Map. It's been around for quite a while. Maybe some of you have heard of it or have done matrix mapping in your organizations, but it's a framework that was introduced by Steve Zimmerman, Jan Mazoka, and Jean Bell, who are like the gurus of nonprofit capacity building. There are books about this and tools. You could Google it, but this is just sort of kind of a high level overview of the framework that is called the Matrix Max and it helps have conversations about mission impact and sustainability of individual programs, right? And it pays attention to sort of that dual bottom line for nonprofits that makes us different and unique compared to for-profit entities, right? We care about delivering on our mission promises, but we also have to do that in a sustainable way. So we have a dual bottom line, which is one of the unique challenges for nonprofit leaders that make it us different from business leaders. So using this tool to map programs is based on sort of looking at what is the program's impact on our mission goals, and then how sustainable or how profitable is the organization. And then you just plot these on this axis, right? The middle axis is impact, and then, or the vertical axis is impact, and the horizontal axis is profitability, right? So this is where you would place organizations based on their impact and their profitability in these different quadrants of the tool. And it's just a visual way of getting a better understanding of what programs are more profitable, what programs are more impactful, and then it'll help guide some strategic decisions down the road. You had a question, Laura?
Yeah, I just want to make sure like I'm thinking about profitability in the right like kind of lens for nonprofits. I'm assuming that means like a program that has access to funds and resources,
Yeah.
right? It's not necessarily that we're making money off of it, but that I mean people want to fund it, right?
Totally.
Okay.
Right. You
People want
have
to
to
fund
spend
it,
at least 10 minutes.
and a lot of times you need to think about, especially in the social service space where you have a lot of restricted funding through government contracts, through grants, that profitability piece then really becomes like how much of our unrestricted fundraising do we have to put into that program to get it to pencil. Okay, so if is your government contract covering 60% of that program, or is it covering 95% of that program? So that's, I think, more the profitability that's going to come up, because then it's how much of our unrestricted resources do we have to then put into subsidize that. And so in a lot of ways, and this is the thing that we have to think about, is those public sources of funding. We have to, every single public source, there's never a public source that is covering 100% of your program. You're always having to subsidize some part of that. The level of profitability is how much of that subsidy, okay? Because, and especially in times of crisis, the more flexible dollars you have, the more adaptive you can be. And so if you have a program that you're having to sink all of those flexible dollars into, that's kind of internally tying your hands. But great question, Laura.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think the term profitability is something that, as nonprofit leaders, we don't hear a lot. We may not be comfortable with because it sounds very corporate-y, but we're really talking about, does this program have designated funds? Is it sustainable? So if you look at the different quadrants, this is where you would sort of where you would park different programs, right? So the upper quadrants are both high mission impact quadrants, right? So your programs that deliver a lot of mission impact, you would place somewhere in those upper quadrants. You may have a program that has a lot of designated funds to support it. So that would be in the upper right quadrant, right? It has high impact in terms of mission delivery, and it has a lot of designated funding, and those funding sources are sustainable. So then you would just you would rank it there. If it's a program that has high mission impact, but it's not been easy to get funded, you don't have sustainable funding sources, you would put it somewhere in that upper left quadrant. For a program that has a lot of funding, it's highly profitable, it's sustainable, but it doesn't deliver a lot of mission impact. Maybe it serves only a handful of folks, but you keep the program because maybe it brings in more money than it needs, and it's able to subsidize other sort of high mission impact but low profitable programs. That's the kind of program you would put in the lower right quadrant. And then that lower left quadrant is programs that don't deliver a lot of mission impact. Maybe it's a program your organization has had for years and years, maybe even decades. It feels like it's a legacy program. Maybe it feels like it's part of your organization's brand and how the community thinks about your work, but maybe only a few people are benefiting from it, and maybe the benefit is no longer as relevant as it was 10 or 15 years ago, and it's not able to bring in money to sustain itself, right? And by money, just as Anthony said, we're talking about all of the different revenue streams that flow into nonprofits, government contracts. Maybe you have earned revenue through third party or program fees, and then contributed revenue sources, foundation grants and individual donors, right? So those programs with low mission impact and that aren't very sustainable and don't have a designated funding would go in that lower left quadrant, if that makes sense. So different factors obviously go into determining both impact and profitability. It's a process, and ideally it's a process that should involve different stakeholder groups in your organization. In other words, as organizational leaders, it's probably not going to be accurate to do the matrix map on your own, but to invite other stakeholders, especially people who are involved in making organizational decisions, your staff leadership team, your board of directors, certainly board officers, would be helpful to have at the table in figuring out the matrix map, and then just going through what the criteria are. Make sure there's a common understanding for determining impact, mission impact, and for determining profitability or sustainability. So this and you can find lots of resources about the matrix map. Just Google it. The book, I think, is really, really helpful. It's been sort of a Bible for me as an organizational leader when I'm having to think about some tough choices ahead of the organization. This is a way to sort of plot it out in a way that feels like there's some objective criteria that we're applying to the decision making. This is especially helpful when you have some folks in your organization, staff and or board, who are really attached to a particular program. It's a beloved program, but maybe it's not as impactful as it was 10 years ago, and maybe it's not very profitable. This allows you to have those conversations and take some of the feelings sort of out of it. So here's an example of a matrix map for a community center, and this comes from an article from the Nonprofit Quarterly. And this organization, or this example, sort of plotted out its core programs along the matrix, and the organization that was most impactful and profitable has sort of the larger circle, and that's like their community festival, right? That brings in a lot of money. So they sort of plotted it as highly profitable, and I guess low impact because it's a festival. Maybe it's not like a direct service program, but it brings in a lot of money that helps supplement some of the less profitable but higher impact programs like their after school tutoring program and their summer programming. So to start off this process, you need to identify what your core service activities are, or your lines of business, to use sort of for-profit terms. And identifying your lines of business can include your fundraising activities, like in this case, the community festival, which is, a big fundraiser for this organization and helps subsidize some of the core program activities. And then assess the relative mission impact, right? And again, as organizational leaders and as stakeholders in organizations, we like to think all of our programs are equally important. We can't do without them. But the reality is, some programs are more impactful than others. And when you are faced with significant cuts in funding, you have to have these conversations. You have to decide what are core programs, what do we need to keep. Back to the slide that Anthony showed us before we started talking about the matrix map, what are our must-haves? What are nice to haves? What are our core programs? This process helps you identify that. And then determine profitability. How much does this particular program or business line contribute to the organization financially? Is it self-sustainable? Is it 100% funded? Is through restricted funding sources? Is it 95% funded? Is it 90% funded? All of that's going to impact where you place that program activity on the matrix map. And then the resulting grid helps you sort of see visually where we need to focus as we're doing scenario planning. What programs need to be subsidized, what programs are highly profitable, can help subsidize those others. So for instance, in your matrix map, if you don't have a highly profitable program, like in this case, the community festival, that brings in money that subsidizes some low profitable program or core activities, then you probably have to think about those as maybe potential levers you can pull when you're doing your scenario planning, if that makes sense. It's a really helpful tool. It's a really helpful exercise, especially when there's lots of feelings about certain program and activities. And sometimes that gets in the way of us having sort of conversations that lead to decisions about how we're going to use the resources that we do have wisely and effectively. This helps sort of plot it out in a way that takes sort of the personal feelings out of it, hopefully. So ultimately, what the matrix map exercise does, it integrates conversations about both impact and financial sustainability in our organizations. And oftentimes we don't have these conversations, right? When we are thinking about launching a new program or initiative, we're thinking about, how is this meeting an identified community need? How is this going to help us be more impactful in our community? How is it going to help us serve a client population we haven't been able to effectively serve? We often don't, at those points of program planning and thinking about launching a new idea, we often don't think about, well, is this new initiative or program going to be sustainable over time? As if we have a dedicated 3-year grant to start this new program, what's going to happen when that grant sunsets, especially if it's not a renewable grant? In other words, it's not enough to have high impact programs if there's no strategy for sustaining that work, especially, if it's a new initiative or program that maybe gets a 1-year grant commitment, like, what's going to happen in 12 months? And what's going to happen to the people who are staffing that program and benefiting from that program? Something to think about. We have to integrate conversations about program impact and financial sustainability. So separating these conversations is one of the sort of deep flaws in the whole sort of nonprofit business planning and strategic planning process, right? So by integrating these conversations, by using tools like the matrix map, we are actually building sustainability for our programs and getting out in front of potential challenges down the road that we're going to have to make decisions about. So any questions about the matrix map?
Highly encourage you to do that exercise with a big team, because when people do that, they have their own self kind of aha moments, and it kind of really, again, as Deborah said, it kind of takes that personal tie and connection away. And when you start seeing it, it's like, oh, okay, now I understand. So it's a really good team exercise to do, and especially do it when you're not in crisis, so that way you're thinking clearly. So all of this then leads to what's the potential action plan that we're going to create for this scenario, okay? And I want to really challenge you when you're creating those action plans to really boil it down to kind of really simple terms, because when you're in the moment of crisis, you don't have time to go read a novel about here's our action plan. So these action plans, I challenge you to, one, you need to write it down, because I guarantee you won't remember when you're in time of crisis. So write it down, and challenge yourself to write it down onto a single page, 2 tops, if it's something that's really big and complex. But I like to start with the who, what, where, why, and how, because it really, I think, focuses our action plan to get down to that level of simplicity, okay? Because if it's simple, it's a lot easier to implement, okay? If we have to start thinking about, to implement our action plan, we need to like brush off our calculus skills, it's just not going to happen. So first thing is, for those different scenarios, the action plan, you need to pick someone who's going to own that scenario, okay? So in times of crisis, you want to identify who in the organization is going to own this scenario and implementing this action plan. Now, they're not going to necessarily be the sole decision maker, but they're the ones who are project managing. They're going to be in charge of this and coordinating, okay? You then need to identify, well, if this scenario comes to place, what are we going to do? Okay, so actually write down, if this thing happens, we're going to then do A, B, and C, and just write that down in bullets. So it might be, if this funding cut, if 20% reduction in our funding for this program happens, we're going to A, B, and C. We're going to have to reduce this. We're going to have to, change this. Write it down. You also want to be very specific about where within the organization this action is taking place. Okay, and this is really important for people to then really focus on making sure that they are implementing the actions where they need to actually happen. Okay, so if the action is going to affect, just one program, you need to specify that. Okay, because otherwise people might start to bring in and start changing things in other parts of the organization that aren't necessarily going to impact this. So a lot of times it's what's top of mind, and so we want to really be clear about where in the organization are we going to be implementing this change. You also need to outline, okay, when do we need to take action? Okay, and this is kind of those go, no go points. Okay, so when do we need to start implementing this action plan when this scenario happens? Okay, and there might be scenarios where you need to phase that in. So, okay, first thing, we're going to phase in this first portion of it and see how that happens. Then we might need to reassess and say, well, that got us 80% of the way there, so now we're going to implement phase 2. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do all or nothing. It doesn't mean like, oh, we have to cut everything. It's like, well, we might be able to do that in phases. And a lot of times you'll do that when you don't have, there's still kind of questions about like, well, how much cost savings would cutting this thing actually bring? And so you might think about when you're going to take action and phase that in. There are going to be things within your action plan that are going to be decision points. And so this is good, important for you to document how are decisions going to be made during times of crisis. Okay, what is our decision-making process? In our class, financial leadership class, we talked about using the MOCA decision-making framework. Your organizations are going to have a decision-making framework that are informed by your equity lens. So you want to really clarify, how are we making decisions? Okay, are we still implementing decisions the same way? Because in times of crisis, what ends up happening is our normal decision-making process, we tend to throw that out the window, and then one person just takes charge and starts making decisions. That might be what you're actually, for this scenario, you might actually say, this is what we need to do because it's such a big crisis and we're just going to do that. But a lot of times no, we're still going to make decisions within our normal decision-making process. But we need to document that and clarify that for our scenario plan, okay? And then we need to outline what's the timeline for how long is it going to take us to implement the scenario plan. And so that way we know we're staying on track as we're implementing this, okay? Is this something where it's going to take a couple days to implement, or is this something that's going to take a couple months to implement? Map out that timeline, map out like what are those kind of benchmarks that we need to know as we're implementing this action plan for this scenario, we're staying on track, okay? So for your action plan, keep it simple, keep it really high level. You know, this is about creating a framework. It's not about creating the detailed manual, okay? Because you're creating the framework with the best knowledge you have now. When you get in that scenario, you're going to have a lot more knowledge, and so then you can start getting more detailed, more granular. So what we've been walking through has been the general scenario planning kind of process, and you can apply that planning process to any type of scenario, okay? And it's really important to go through and think through and practice that and kind of build that muscle memory around scenario planning. So now we're going to kind of dive into and look at that from just the financial perspective. So how do we scenario plan around financial related issues? You're still going to go through the same process, but now we're going to kind of get into some weeds and share some tools that you can use around the financial planning piece. Because ultimately, if we don't have resources, we don't have money, we don't have the ability to implement our mission. It takes those resources, you know, flowing through our organization to have a mission impact. So before we start, as a financial leader, you need to really make sure that you have internalized and you've done kind of a financial review of your organization, okay? To be able to implement good scenario plan strategies, you need to know where are you starting from financially. And so this means you need to understand your business model. That is how resources flow through your organization. How do we take those donations or take the funds from that government contract? How do we turn those dollars into an impact? How do they flow through our organization, okay? You also need to understand your finance model. What's the type of fuel that our car needs to deliver on that impact, okay? So that means understanding both the restricted and unrestricted sources, you know, the restrictions that those have, you know, those different funding sources have. So what type of fuel do we need to have that impact? Because in times of crisis, we start getting into like, oh, well, we just need more resources. But if you're then in that time bringing in the wrong type of resources, it's actually not going to make it any better, okay? So if you run out of gas and you have a gasoline car, you might go get resources. If it's diesel fuel, it's fuel, it's resources, but it's not going to actually help you, you know, in your situation. You also need to really internalize and know your budget. And this is really important because within our budgets, we're going to have different levers that we can pull when we need to adjust things financially, both on the revenue and the expense side, and we'll walk through some of those. You also need to stay up to date on your current financial position. So that means at least on a monthly basis, you're reviewing your current financial reports, your statement of activities, your statement of financial position, your cash flow forecast. You need to stay up to speed on at least on a monthly basis of what is our current financial position, okay? When crisis happens, that's not the time when you want to go and figure out like, oh, how are we doing financially? You want to make sure that you're staying up on that. And then most importantly, your reserves are kind of your insurance policy in some ways, and kind of in that analogy of when times are challenging, we need to tap into our reserves. That's our rainy day fund. Okay, so we need to know what are our reserves, what do we have access to, because that's then going to determine what type of action plan we can implement. How much time do we have to then pivot? Okay, so that financial review is really important pre-step to financial planning. The next really important thing that you have to stay up on is cash flow. During times of crisis, the thing that tanks most nonprofits is not a lack of revenue, but it's a lack of cash flow, okay? Because of the way funds flow into our organization, we might have revenue coming, but that revenue might not actually come in at the time when we need it to then pay those expenses, especially for those who have a lot of reimbursable contracts, okay? You know, in times of crisis, those reimbursement time frames tend to get dragged out. I mean, we saw at the peak of the pandemic, some government funders were taking 3, 6, 9 months to reimburse things. So the revenue is coming in, but if you don't have the cash, then you're not going to be able to maintain things day to day. So you really have to understand, okay, what's the timing for those different funds coming in? When are those funds coming in? When do we have to pay those expenses? Okay, and so really understanding when payday and when the bills are, how much time is in between when those two things happen. You need to understand, do we have enough day-to-day working capital? So this is the money in your checking account. This is the day-to-day money that you have just to cover the normal operating activities. What's that minimum amount that we need to have just to keep things flowing? Okay, this is separate from like our reserves in case of, break in case of emergency. This is just our normal day-to-day, what do we need to cover? And then you really need to make sure that you're keeping up on your cash flow forecasting and using your budget and using it then to project out your cash flow. So on the next slide, we have what that a sample of what that looks like. In our 7-week or our financial leadership training academy, we spent a lot of time talking about cash flow and the importance of budgeting by month. And so that way you have really accurate projections of what you're anticipating coming in by month for funding. Okay, and so you can take your budget broken out by month, and essentially you should all, I believe we've sent all of those resources to everyone who went through the class. You have the template where you can just plop in at the top, here's our starting cash balance, and then it'll calculate, well, what do we have as far as those peaks and valleys of our cash, okay? And when it comes to financial scenario planning, what I then encourage you to do is, especially for on the revenue side, is go through and highlight, okay, what of our funding sources are at risk based on that scenario? Okay, so that way we can keep that top of mind. We can plan then for that financially. So if we know, okay, we're planning ahead saying we have like 3 grants that are potentially at risk that they might not come through, or they might not come through at the level that we requested, or our special events might not generate as much individual donations as we anticipate because of economic challenges. So highlight those items and go through and use your cash flow as a scenario plan for, well, what happens if that $50,000 grant in October doesn't come through? Do we still have enough cash to maintain operations while we then go seek additional sources? Or what happens if that's reduced by 20%? Okay, so you can use your cash flow report to play with those different scenarios. So have your main one and then create a copy that says, here's one for this scenario, and we're going to go through and take out those funding sources. What's that going to do to our amount of cash? Because this is then going to help you identify how much cash do we need to then plan for our reserves. And there are different types of reserve. So our day-to-day working capital, that is the amount that you have in your checking account. That's just covering the flow of money in and out just to cover our bills. Okay, how much do you need to have in there? That might be a couple months of expenses, like if you're on a reimbursement basis, and just to kind of account for some variations in that timing. And then you have your operating reserve, and this is that break glass in case of emergency pot of money. And it's really important as you go through those scenarios to identify how much reserves do we need to have to maintain our current operations for stability while we are implementing this plan, okay? While we are pivoting, okay? And that amount's going to vary depending on every single organization. That might be we need 3 months. That might mean we need 12 months of operating expenses in reserve, okay? So when you go through those scenarios and then you go through and look at it from a financial perspective, this then helps you to identify how much operating reserves are the right amount of operating reserves for us to have, okay? And when you do that, then you can create a plan for how do we build that amount of money, okay? Or you might, identify that and say, okay, we don't have that amount of money right now. And so if this scenario comes into play and our target would be we need 9 months of operating reserves, but we only have 3 months, that's then going to influence the type of action plan that you can put into place, okay? Those reserves gives us the runway to then be able to implement different strategies. The more runway you have, the more flexibility you have to implement those strategies. So one of the things that we have to think about as a leader then are what are those financial levers that we can pull. And this is why doing that initial financial review is so important. So we have both revenue and expense levers that we can pull within our organization that can adjust our financials. Now, not all of those levers can we pull equally. Okay, some levers are going to be really hard to pull because they're tied to a lot of restricted funding. Okay, but first, I'd like to start with what are those revenue levers that we can pull. Okay, so the first, the break glass in case of emergency, that's our reserves. Okay, so that's a big lever that we can pull, but it's a lever that we don't want to pull lightly. Okay, so we want to think about when we pull that, because as you start drawing down on those reserves, to address one scenario, what happens if a second scenario happens at the same time? Okay, now we have less reserves. And so you always want to be cautious about when you're tapping into those reserves. Another lever you can pull is investing in fundraising activities. Maybe we're going to lean into doing some additional fundraising. Maybe we're going to put out a special appeal, which might solve a short-term problem, but you got to be really careful because you can only put out those special appeals to save us in that time of crisis so many times. Okay, eventually, donors will say like, well, everything is a crisis, so maybe this one really isn't. You might look at, can we pursue some additional unrestricted revenue sources that gives us that flexibility? And maybe we're going to invest in some of our fundraising activities that are going to raise, say, donations from individuals. Another revenue thing is maybe going back to some of those foundations or government funders and renegotiating some of those contracts. This happened a lot during the pandemic where we all had a lot of restricted funds, and organizations went to their funders and saying, you know what, these restrictions, this contract doesn't make sense in this new operating environment. Here are some changes that we need to make to still be able to have the impact that we want to have. So don't be afraid to go back and maybe renegotiate some of those contracts. To do that, you need to maintain good relationships with those funders. On the expense side, you need to look at, what are your expense levers you can pull. For most organizations, personnel is going to be our single largest budget item. Okay, it takes a lot of people to do the work, and people, take a lot of resources to pay those people. So knowing within your budget what personnel expenses can and can't we cut, okay, and when do we start cutting into the bone? You also want to look at some of those things that are variable expenses or external to organization, like contractors or consultants. Okay, maybe we need to hit pause on implementing this thing. Deborah already talked about those low emission activities. You might need to delay capital expenditures. Okay, but sometimes you can only delay things for so long. So again, you need to kind of think through what are those levers and what are those consequences, both intended and not, of pulling each of those. Okay. And then ultimately, if you have things that are not funded through restricted funds that are using a lot of your unrestricted resources, that's someplace to potentially pull that lever so you can direct those unrestricted funds towards those other programs. Okay.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. We want to sort of talk about the scenario planning guide that we sent you at the end of day yesterday. Anthony, I don't think we're going to have time to trade screens and actually show the guide. But essentially the first section of that scenario planning guide that we sent is sort of like a pre-planning organizational review. There's a section that asks you to identify priorities that need action right now. And this is just sort of setting the stage, getting some things out of the way that may impact your ability to implement an emergency scenario plan down the road. And so there's sort of a checklist in the guide that asks you about mission alignment stuff, sort of going back to sort of high profitability, high impact, low profitability, low impact stuff. Questions about leadership. Do we have the right people and the right seats on the bus right now in terms of our leadership team and our board to sort of navigate the potential challenges that we're seeing in the operating environment? Management and operations, are those running smoothly and efficiently? Some sort of financial analysis like Anthony just walked us through around sustainability, what are reserves, how long of a ramp do we have if one or more of our funding streams goes away, and then just like programs and services, what are our core programs and services? And then the tool, helps you determine what is your operating reserves, or what's commonly referred to as LUNA, liquid unrestricted net assets, because you can't use restricted funds to determine what your operating reserves are. Those funds are obligated for particular program activities, right? When you're trying to figure out what is our operating reserve, how much money do we have, liquid, unrestricted net assets, to support our programs and operations if one or more of our funding streams goes away. That's a really critical step before you get into developing different budget scenarios. You need to know your LUNA. And then, as Anthony just said, you need to identify the budget levers that you can pull. And that includes adjustments to the expense side of your budget, as well as revenue strategies to bring in more revenue or diverse revenue streams. So that first section of the tool walks you through that sort of pre-planning organizational review through mostly checklists, pretty simple. And then there's the second part of the tool, which is developing the budget scenarios for those 4 different scenarios we've already talked about: the minimal risk, moderate risk, significant risk, and worst risk, right? But to help you figure that out, there's a section in the tool that asks you to identify what are these key factors or uncertainties that are affecting our funding, and how important are those, and how at risk are those. And that'll help you sort of develop the 4 different budget scenarios for those different levels of risk. And then there's a section that asks you to identify stuff that you could do now, action steps that you can take right now, their priorities for action. Maybe they come from that pre-planning review of things that we need to take care of now. And, like overdue reports to funders, like get that out of the way. Like, you don't want that to be an issue when you're scenario planning, right? You want to have you want to be in compliance with all of your government funders, especially. So anyway, that section will allow you to identify action steps for right now, small scale actions you can take right now, flexible actions to help mitigate, especially low or moderate risk, and then long-term actions. And then based on all of that, and hopefully these are conversations with organizational decision makers, you can focus on creating your budget scenarios. And we suggest that you start off with, just your functional budget. And this is the functional budget example that we used in class. Remember when we talked about cost allocation planning and developing a functional budget that shows all of your cost centers, your functional and your programmatic expenses? That's this budget. So you take your functional budget and you just start to highlight what's at risk. So for example, a foundation grant in this example is at risk. So you can sort of identify what you need to scenario plan for. And remember, you're going to be assessing these risk levels based on minimal risk, moderate risk, significant risk, or worst case scenario, our mission is at risk, right? So maybe in your functional budget example, as you're identifying these different revenue streams, maybe you will have highlighted, 3 or 4 revenue streams that are at risk. Maybe just one revenue stream like government contracts, but it makes up such a significant chunk of your overall revenue. It's a pretty significant risk. This is going to then help you sort of figure out what kind of budget scenarios and adjustments you need to make on the expense side. So in the tool, we provide sample budget scenarios based on the 4 levels of risk. In the first scenario, it's minimal risk, it's assuming stable funding, and you're going to be able to maintain current operations, so that's probably where you want to start with your own scenario budgets. And then there's moderate risk that shows decreases in 2 major funding streams, but the decreases are moderate, they're slight, 15% reductions in government and foundation grants, while the contributed revenue streams are holding steady. That's a typical moderate risk scenario. Significant risk assumes losses of support from 2 major funding streams. In this case, in the scenario that we've built as an example. It's a 50% reduction in government support and a 33% reduction in foundation grants. And that's not unlikely because we know that foundations often shift their grant-making priorities. So this scenario also shows some moderate declines in contributed revenue streams because as organizations start to reduce staff positions, especially if they decide to reduce non-program staff positions first, there's probably less people focusing on individual donor cultivation and special events. So that then has a ripple effect in terms of contributed revenue streams. And then the fourth scenario, that mission at risk scenario, that includes significant decreases in funding across the board, forcing significant staff reductions, which leaves even fewer staff to cultivate individual donors, corporate donors, plan events, and all of that. So here's what those scenarios look like, right? So, and again, using the same functional budget example we've been talking about in NFLA, the scenario one, the minimal risk scenario, shows pretty stable operations, right? That's assuming even a slight surplus at the end of the year because most of the revenue streams aren't at risk. In scenario two, the moderate risk scenario, you can see some reductions in government and foundation grants, but contributed revenue is holding steady. So they've made some reductions in terms of personnel and some minor adjustments to some of the non-personnel line items to bring their total expense projection down to about $763,000. But in this moderate risk scenario, they're still hoping for maybe a little slight budget surplus, a little cushion of $1,500. Scenario three, significant risk, looks very different, right? They're talking, this shows a 50% reduction in government funding, significant loss of foundation grants, and then some impacts on those contributed revenue streams from individuals, corporations, and special events, right? And then more significant adjustments on the expense side, especially the personnel line item, because again, that's our largest expense as a nonprofit. And that if we have if we're going to incur significant cuts to our funding sources, to absorb those cuts, we have to look at reduction in forces or personnel cuts. There's just no way around it, right? And then the fourth case scenario is, government funding's almost disappeared. Foundation giving is less than half of what it used to be. And then the ripple effect in terms of contributed revenue, because no one's focused on that anymore. And that's, a total revenue projection of about $250,000. And the organization is faced with, can we continue? Can we go on? Should we start having conversations about strategic partnerships, mergers, fiscal sponsorship types arrangements? The worst case scenario is the scenario that should trigger those kinds of conversations. Can we continue? And some organizations wait for things to be really, really in crisis, and then they just sort of close their doors overnight. And that's not a great way to continue, to serve your community, right? You want to get out in front of this if you can. And sunsetting an organization is only one option. There are lots of other options if you are in scenario four, the worst case scenario where your mission is at risk. You could be talking about transferring core programs or legacy programs to another organization. You can talk about a complete merger. There's lots of different ways to think about scenario four, which is a whole other webinar. But I just want to, put that out there because the idea of sunsetting our organizations is often like our worst nightmare, or maybe it's what keeps us up at night. But even within scenario four, we have different options that ensure that our work continues on, that the community is still being served, but maybe not by our organization anymore, if that makes sense. So that was a lot, especially when you think about scenario four, because that's like the existential threat, right? And hopefully none of you are there right now, but some of you may be. you know, so it's important to sort of be realistic and get out in front of that. So we've got some quick suggestions here for you as you embark on scenario planning at your organization. Do you want to run through this real quick, Anthony?
So one thing I really encourage you to don't do this alone. Okay, scenario planning is something best done when you have a team. Okay, because it also builds buy-in, but also it builds the organization's resiliency because you have more people who have gone through and built that scenario planning kind of muscle. So create a task force around those different scenarios. Bring in the right people to think through that, because you also you get new different ideas. So diversity of ideas in this case will help you get outside of just thinking in the same box that we've always been thinking in. So bring together a task force. For each of your scenarios, go through the process, use the tool the same way. Okay, so this is about building muscle memory. So if you've ever played a sport or played an instrument, it's about practice. And so use the same process that we just outlined for every single scenario. So you're building that process, and then it makes scenario planning easier and easier and faster as you've built that kind of muscle memory. Okay, as a leader in your organization, you really need to create the space and really encourage the team to have those hard conversations. Have those hard conversations now when you're not in crisis. It's a lot easier than having those hard conversations when you are. And so asking yourself, are our programs sustainable? Do we have any sacred programs that no one's willing to talk about because of whatever? Okay. And so you want to really make sure that all of your cards are on the table. You really need to spend the time now to do that mission matrix exercise to understand where do our programs fall as far as the impact to our community that we're serving and the cost that it takes to do that. Okay, do that now. And so that way, when you are in times of crisis, you can then pull from that information that you've already done and then go and implement your strategy. You need to know for each of those different scenarios that you create is at what level of risk is this, and you need to then prioritize. Especially right now when there's so much being thrown at you, so quickly. Prioritization is your friend. Okay, so identify what are those big risk things. So the higher up that is in that scale, the more you need to kind of focus on those topics first. Also, you need to give permission to be adaptable. Just because you create a plan now doesn't mean 6 months from now that it's gonna, you're not gonna have new information and you need to adjust that. Okay, so these are designed to be guides. They're not designed to be set in stone. Okay, right now you need to continually be monitoring, the external operating environment to understand and know when do we need to implement that scenario. And so going back to each of those scenarios, how I said, pick a person who's going to own that scenario, and then that person is then responsible for monitoring it. So that way, not one person is having to monitor all of these. Okay, so you can spread that out among your organization, among your team, so not one person is feeling that burden of having to track all of these things. And then make sure you're keeping up on your forecasts and making sure your financial data is up to speed. So I know this is a lot. I know you have a lot on your plate, and I really encourage you to carve out some time now, even though it feels hard, but carve out some time. Carve out start with an hour and say, we're going to walk through one scenario. Okay. The more you practice, the quicker it gets, but we need to be doing this now. So that way, when those things do happen, and it's just a matter of if, not a matter of if, but a matter of when, you're ready to go. So we appreciate you taking some time out of your day to walk through this. We are going to be sending up a follow-up email with all of the tools and resources and the slides. Devin recorded this, so this is going to be available for you to rewatch, or if you want to share this with your team as well. And then as part of our work with HGRA, we are offering private one-on-one coaching sessions. So we're going to send in that, we'll send it in that follow-up email, a link where you can schedule time to meet with Deborah and I. We have some big time blocks spread out over the next couple of weeks. So if you want to come through, talk through, it's a safe space. We can help you kind of brainstorm, troubleshoot. So it's optional, but feel free to grab those times.
And we're at time, but Anthony and I can stick around for a few minutes if folks have questions. Any questions, comments?
Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure learning from you guys. I look forward to the times when I can turn on my computer and go, there they are.
Heather, it was good to see you too.
It's good to see you guys. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.